Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at U.S. politics and media,
Mm.
and specifically how they kind of all work together, like the government agencies and the funding and just all the information we consume.
Yeah.
So the content we're looking at today is this episode that a listener sent to us from a Chinese language YouTube show.
Okay.
It's called S-Way.
What's that mean?
That means sky high and ocean wide, but the show's title actually translates to limitless,
Okay.
which I think is pretty fitting considering the scope of what they're claiming in this episode.
Gotcha.
So this episode is tackling some really hot button issues,
Okay.
like alleged financial links between the U.S. government and all these different media outlets, and not just in the U.S., but internationally too.
Wow.
And they're arguing that these links are all part of this big plan to push a specific agenda.
And what agenda are they saying it is?
They're claiming it's specifically a left-leaning one. Yeah, so I think it's important to keep in mind who's producing this show.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's coming from outside the U.S., so it probably has its own biases and its own viewpoints.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's something we always have to remember when we're looking at any kind of media, especially when it's coming from a different cultural context.
Exactly. So it's going to be really important to analyze these claims really carefully, don't you think?
Definitely. We have to think critically and consider all the different angles.
For sure. So let's get into it. This episode really puts Elon Musk in the spotlight.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like that Elon Musk.
Okay.
It's kind of wild.
Oh.
They portray him as this head of a fictional department.
A fictional department.
Yeah, it's called the Government Efficiency Regulatory Department.
Interesting.
I know, right? Like he's some kind of political superhero who's going around investigating and exposing government spending, particularly within USAID.
USAID.
Yeah, the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Okay.
And to really grab your attention right from the start, they throw out some pretty big numbers.
Like what?
Well, they claim that USAID spends something like $500 million every single year.
Wow.
Which they say is basically like burning $1 billion of taxpayer money every week.
Okay, yeah, those are some eye-catching figures.
Right. And I think regardless of your political beliefs, government spending is something that always gets people talking.
Oh, for sure.
But I think those numbers might be a little misleading.
How so?
Well, they don't really explain what USAID actually does,
Right. It's important to understand what they're spending that money on.
Exactly. It's a real U.S. government agency, and their mission is to provide foreign aid and development assistance all over the world.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah, so they support all these programs focused on global health, economic growth, democracy, and humanitarian assistance.
So it's a pretty big operation.
Huge. A massive undertaking with a massive budget.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So it makes sense why people would be watching their spending really closely.
Yeah.
And that's where their main claim comes in. They're alleging that USAID is actually funneling money to all these different media outlets.
But like which ones?
Oh, big names, the New York Times, Politico, even the BBC.
Yeah.
And they're saying that this is all to influence their coverage and push that left-leaning agenda they were talking about.
So they're saying the government is trying to influence the media through funding.
That's exactly it. And it actually ties into this broader idea of soft power,
Soft power.
It's this idea that governments can try to influence people and build relationships through culture and information rather than using military force.
Oh, okay. So like winning hearts and minds instead of territory.
Exactly. So the show is basically arguing that the U.S. government is using USA as a tool for soft power.
Interesting.
Yeah. And they get really specific with their examples, too.
Oh, like what?
Well, they spend a lot of time focusing on this one nonprofit called Internews.
Internews. Never heard of it.
Yeah, it's NN for short.
Mm-hmm.
And they support independent media all over the world. The show claims that NN receives something like $472 million from USAID.
Wow.
And get this. They claim that this organization with hundreds of millions of dollars is operating out of a small bungalow in California.
That doesn't really add up, does it?
Not really. And they even try to tie IN to the CIA.
Ooh.
Which always makes things more interesting, right?
Definitely adds a layer of intrigue.
But here's where things get really dramatic.
Okay.
According to this episode, NN just suddenly shut down in December 2024.
Really?
Yeah, right after Trump's re-election.
Oh, wow.
Staff disappeared, everything.
So they're saying it was like a cover-up.
That's exactly what they're implying. I have to admit, it makes for a pretty good story.
It does. But it also makes you wonder...
About?
Well, I mean, are they actually presenting any evidence to back up these claims? you know?
Well, good point.
Like, what proof do they have of financial links between USAI and these media organizations?
Yeah.
Or that USAI is dictating what they report on?
Yeah. Are there any other sources that support this?
Exactly. Or is it all just based on what this one show is saying?
That's something to think about for sure.
Definitely. And, we also have to consider if there might be other reasons why Internews shut down.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it wasn't a cover-up at all.
What else could it be?
Well, maybe they just lost funding, or their strategy changed.
Oh, right. That makes sense.
It's important to consider all the possibilities before we jump to conclusions.
Sure.
So, yeah, just something to keep in mind as we continue to analyze this.
Good point. They also spend some time comparing Trump's first and second terms.
Oh, really? How so?
They suggest that during his first term, he was totally in the dark about all these alleged activities and couldn't do anything to stop them.
But in his second term...
Now he's got allies like Elon Musk on his side, and they're supposedly exposing and dismantling this whole system.
Interesting. So they're painting him as this sort of crusader against corruption.
Pretty much. It's all very dramatic.
Yeah, it's a pretty compelling narrative when you think about it.
It is. But it also makes you wonder about their motivations.
Right, like, is this episode really just about exposing corruption?
Or is it trying to push a specific political agenda?
That's the big question, isn't it?
And it's one that we'll keep exploring as we dive into the rest of this episode.
Can't wait to see where it goes from here.
Me too! Stay tuned, everybody. Okay, so this Limitless episode moves on to another organization, and they're claiming this one is also linked to USAID.
Okay. And which one is this?
It's the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED for short.
NED.
Okay. But they don't really have nice things to say about it.
What do they say about it?
Well, they make it sound like it's this super shadowy organization.
Shadowy?
Yeah, that's sending money to all these pro-democracy groups all over the world.
Okay.
But they claim the goal is actually regime change.
Regime change.
Yeah, they're saying that the NED is behind all these color revolutions and political upheavals.
What?
It's like they're saying the U.S. is using the NED to interfere in other countries' affairs.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. It sounds like something straight out of a spy movie,
Oh, no, right. All this talk of regime change and shadowy organizations.
But the NED is a real organization, though, right?
Oh, yeah, it's a real organization.
Okay.
And it does get funding from the U.S. government.
Yeah.
Their official mission is to support democracy-building efforts all over the world.
What does that even mean, though? Like, what do they actually do?
Well, it includes things like promoting free and fair elections.
Okay.
And strengthening civil society.
Okay.
Advocating for human rights, that kind of thing.
So, on the surface, it sounds like they're doing good things, right?
Yeah, I mean, those are all generally considered positive things, right?
Right. But this episode is trying to paint a different picture.
What is he saying?
Well, they're basically arguing that the NED is just a tool of U.S. foreign policy.
Okay.
They're saying it's all about using taxpayer money to push American interests around the world.
And they're using democracy promotion as a cover.
Exactly. They even use the term neocolonialism.
Neocolonialism.
Well, yeah. Like it's a new form of imperialism.
Right. So they're saying that the U.S. is trying to control other countries through financial and political influence.
That's exactly it. And they give some specific examples to support their argument.
Like what?
Well, they talk about the NED's activities in Ukraine.
Ukraine.
They claim that the NED had a hand in the 2014 revolution that ousted the pro-Russian president.
Okay.
They also highlight the NED's work in Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Saying that they supported the pro-democracy protests back in 2019.
Right, so they're pointing to these events as evidence of the NED's involvement in regime change.
Pretty much. They're trying to make the case that the U.S. is meddling in other countries' affairs under the guise of promoting democracy.
Which is a perspective we often hear from countries that have had, let's say, a complicated relationship with the U.S.
For sure. And this episode definitely doesn't shy away from accusing the U.S. of meddling.
What do they say?
They go so far as to say that the NED is a front for U.S. intelligence agencies.
Right.
Yeah. They're basically saying that democracy promotion is just a cover for more sinister activities.
Like what kind of activities?
Well, they even imply that the NED might be involved in things like assassinations and covert operations.
Ah, that's a big jump.
I know, right? It's pretty wild stuff.
It is. But it's important to remember that these are just claims.
Yeah.
Coming from one source.
Sure.
So we need to be careful about taking it all at face value.
Right. We should always look for evidence from other sources before we believe something like that.
Exactly. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as they say.
They do try to back up their claims, though.
How so?
Well, they dig into the backgrounds of some of the people who are involved with the NED.
Oh, yeah.
And, for example, they point out that the guy who founded the NED,
Yeah.
he was an intelligence official during the Cold War.
Interesting.
And they use that as evidence that the NED has ties to the intelligence community.
Well, it's true that the NED was created during the Cold War, which was a time of intense ideological conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Right.
So it's not surprising that an organization like the NED would emerge in that context.
I guess that makes sense.
But, organizations can change over time.
Yeah.
Their missions can evolve.
Right.
So we can't just assume that the NED is still doing the same things it was doing back then.
True. We need to look at what they're doing now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to look at their current activities and their funding.
Good point. They also bring up the fact that the NED has been criticized by people on both sides of the political spectrum in the U.S.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like some people on the left.
Yeah.
They see the NED as a tool of U.S. imperialism.
Okay.
And then some people on the right, they criticize the NED for its spending and whether it's actually effective.
So no matter what they do, they're going to get criticized by somebody.
It seems like it. It's like they can't win.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
Because it shows that even within the U.S., there's no clear agreement on what the role of the NED should be.
Yeah. Yeah. Some people think it's essential for promoting democracy and human rights.
Right.
And others think it's a waste of money or even harmful.
Exactly. It's a really complex issue.
It is. They even quote a former U.S. diplomat.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And this diplomat supposedly said that the NED is a great way to spend other people's money.
Wow. That's pretty cynical.
It is. But it makes you think, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Like, what are the real motivations behind all this foreign aid?
Right. Is it really about helping other countries, or is it more about serving U.S. interests?
Exactly. And of course, they tie all of this back to their main argument about USAID and media influence.
Okay. How so?
Well, they claim that the NED is giving money to media outlets and journalists all over the world.
Okay.
And that this is shaping the coverage to be more pro-U.S.
Right. So it's all part of this soft power strategy we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. They're basically saying that the U.S. is trying to control the global narrative through organizations like USAID and the NED. Yeah. And to illustrate this point, they talk about specific examples like Radio Free Europe or Radio Liberty.
Oh, yeah.
And Voice of America.
Okay.
Those U.S. government-funded broadcasters that operate in countries where there isn't a lot of press freedom.
Right. Those are pretty well known.
They are. And they've always been kind of controversial.
How so?
Well, on one hand, they're providing news and information to people who might not otherwise have access to it.
Right.
Which is good for freedom of information, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they're funded by the U.S. government.
Right. Which raises questions about their objectivity.
Exactly. And this Limitless episode really emphasizes that point.
What do they say?
They're saying that these broadcasters are just another part of this big effort to control the narrative and make the U.S. look good.
Okay.
They even play this clip of a U.S. official talking about how important it is to win the information war.
Win the information war.
Yeah. It sounds kind of scary, doesn't it?
It does sound a bit ominous.
Right. Like it's all about manipulating people's perceptions.
Yeah, it kind of feeds into that whole idea that there's this battle going on to control information and influence public opinion.
Exactly. And of course, they couldn't talk about information control without bringing up social media.
Oh, yeah, of course.
They claim that U.S. government agencies are using platforms like Facebook and Twitter to spread propaganda and manipulate people.
That's not a new accusation.
It's not. And they even mention the whole Russian interference thing from the 2016 election.
Right, that definitely raised a lot of concerns about the role of social media in politics.
It did. It was a big wake-up call for a lot of people.
Yeah, it showed how vulnerable our systems can be to manipulation.
And this episode is pretty critical of those social media companies.
What do they say?
They're basically accusing them of putting profits ahead of democracy.
Okay.
And they say there needs to be more regulation to stop these platforms from being used to manipulate people.
That's a common argument these days.
It is. A lot of people are calling for more regulation of social media.
It's a tough issue, though.
I know, right? Like, how do you strike a balance between free speech and preventing the spread of harmful content?
Exactly. It's like a catch-22.
It is. And there's no easy answer.
For sure.
But it's definitely a conversation we need to be having.
Absolutely. This episode has given us a lot to think about.
It has. It's raised some important questions about government.
And media.
And technology and how they all influence how we see the world.
For sure. What about you? What are your thoughts on all of this?
I'm curious to hear what stood out to you.
Well, one thing that I keep thinking about is One thing that keeps coming back to me is this whole idea that there's this hidden force controlling everything we see and hear.
Yeah, they really push that narrative in this episode.
They do. And it's not just USAID and the NE.
What else do they talk about?
Well, in this last part, they actually point the finger right at the CIA.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're accusing the CIA of being directly involved in spreading propaganda and manipulating the media.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. And they even use the term deep state.
Deep state. Yeah, like that idea that there's this secret network of powerful people working behind the scenes, pulling the strings and controlling everything.
Yeah, that's a pretty common trope in conspiracy theories.
It is, but they're presenting it as if it's fact. They make it sound like the CIA is this rogue organization that's using its power to control information and manipulate public opinion.
So what are they saying the CIA is doing exactly?
Well, they actually claim that the CIA has infiltrated media organizations.
Oh.
Yeah, and they're saying that they're using journalists as pawns in their propaganda campaigns.
That's a pretty bold claim.
It is. It makes you wonder if they have any evidence to support that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty serious accusation to make without any proof.
They do try to back up their claims with some historical examples, though.
Oh, like what?
Well, they talk about Operation Mockingbird.
Operation Mockingbird.
Yeah, it was this program during the Cold War where the CIA supposedly used journalists to spread propaganda.
Right, I've heard of that.
And they also bring up some more recent controversies.
Like what?
Like the CIA's use of torture after 9/11.
Okay.
They're using that as evidence that the CIA is willing to break the law and lie to the public.
Well, those are certainly relevant examples.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that just because something happened in the past doesn't necessarily mean it's happening now.
Sure.
We need to look at the current evidence, not just historical events.
Good point. They also spend some time talking about Edward Snowden.
Oh, Edward Snowden.
Yeah, the guy who leaked all those classified documents about government surveillance?
Right.
They portray him as this hero.
A hero.
Yeah, like he exposed the truth about what the government is really doing.
Okay.
And they use his story to suggest that the government is spying on all of us and trying to control what we know.
Well, the Snowden leaks definitely had a huge impact.
They did.
They sparked a global debate about privacy and security.
For sure.
And they made people question how much power governments should have.
Exactly. And this Limitless episode is all about transparency.
Okay.
They're saying that the public has a right to know what the government is doing, especially when it comes to intelligence agencies.
Right, because there's always the potential for abuse of power.
Exactly. And they even encourage whistleblowers to come forward and expose any wrongdoing.
That's interesting.
It is.
Because it raises this question of how we balance accountability with the need for secrecy.
Oh, that's a good point.
Like, whistleblowers can be really important for holding powerful institutions accountable.
Right.
But they also often face a lot of risks.
Yeah, they can get into a lot of trouble.
Exactly. It's a really complicated issue.
It is. They also mentioned that some former CIA officials have actually criticized the agency.
Really?
Yeah, and they see that as proof that there are rogue elements within the CIA.
Interesting.
They even name specific people.
Oh, like who?
Like John Brennan and James Clapper,
Okay.
who have both been pretty critical of Trump.
Right.
And then there's this one part that's kind of chilling. They play this clip of a former CIA director.
Okay.
And he says something like, "We'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false."
Wow.
I know, right?
That's pretty disturbing.
It is. It's not clear if that quote is real or if they took it out of context.
Right.
But it definitely makes you think.
Yeah, it really highlights the potential dangers of propaganda and disinformation.
Yes, for sure. It makes you realize how important it is to be critical of the information we're consuming.
Absolutely. We can't just believe everything we see and hear.
Exactly. We have to think for ourselves and question things.
And we need to be aware of who's giving us the information and what their motivations might be.
That's such a good point. And I think that's really the main takeaway from this episode.
What's that?
It's a call to be more vigilant,
Okay.
to question the narratives that we're being fed.
Right. And to be aware of the forces that might be trying to manipulate us.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we need to be careful about where we get our information from.
And that we need to be critical thinkers.
For sure. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into this episode of Limitless.
It was a fascinating one.
It was a little unsettling at times, but definitely thought-provoking.
It definitely made us think about the role of government and media in shaping our understanding of the world.
It did. And hopefully it's inspired our listeners to be more curious.
And more skeptical.
Exactly. Always question everything. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
Until next time.
Stay curious.